Title amendment. Those in favor of adoption of the title amendment will please say aye. Those opposed will please say no. The ayes have it. Chair declares the title amendment adopted. The title as amended by the House will be and remain the title of the bill. Gentleman from the 96th.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill take effect from its passage.
The question is on the motion that the bill take effect from passage. Those in favor of the motion will please vote aye. Those opposed will please vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On that question, there were 97 ayes, 0 nays, and 3 members absent. 2/3 of members having voted in the affirmative, the chair declares that bill effective from passage. The clerk will please communicate the action of the House to the Senate. Next bill on third reading.
Committee substitute for House Bill 3042 relating to forbidding excessive government limitations on exercise of religion.
Ladies and gentlemen, this bill was advanced to third reading with 2 amendments pending yesterday. This time, we'll ask the clerk to please report the first amendment.
Delegate Pushkin moves to amend the bill on page 2, section 1, line 22, following the period by inserting a new subsection D to read as follows. C. The provisions of this section do not apply to any federal, state, or local non-discrimination law or ordinance.
The question is on the amendment just read by the clerk. Chair recognizes the sponsor, Gentleman from the 54th, Delegate Pushkin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What this amendment does, it adds a subsection. It's pretty straightforward. The provisions of this section do not apply to any federal, state, or local non-discrimination ordinance. I think this is an important and necessary amendment to this bill to really clarify that the purpose of this bill is not to provide legal cover for those who would discriminate. This makes it very clear it would not be used against any local non-discrimination ordinances and not go against the Federal Civil Rights Act. So I would urge adoption and reserve the right to close.
The question is still on the amendment read by the clerk. Gentleman from the 51st, Delegate Fast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly urge rejection of this amendment. This bill provides a judicial test just for these non-discrimination laws that the gentleman speaks of. When one brings a claim under one of those laws, this bill guides the courts in the process for that very claim. This amendment would be the same as if the legislature passed a crime law setting forth elements of the crime and then stated that the law did not apply to any federal, state, or local laws. For those reasons, ladies and gentlemen, I urge rejection.
The question again is still on the amendment read by the clerk. Is there debate on the amendment? Does the sponsor wish to close debate on the amendment? The gentleman is recognized to close debate on the amendment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The amendment's very simple. I mean, we've heard proponents of this bill say it's not about discrimination. This is not why we're passing this bill. It's about protecting religious freedom. This would say the bill does protect religious freedom, and that's all it does. It would clearly state that it could not provide a legal cover for those who would seek to use this law to discriminate against other citizens. So I would strongly urge adoption of the amendment, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Question is on the amendment as read by the clerk. Roll call vote on the amendment is demanded. Is demand sustained? Demand is sustained. The question is, shall the amendment be adopted? Those in favor of adoption of the amendment will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result. On that question, there are 11 ayes, 83 nays, 6 members absent, less than a majority in the affirmative. Chair declares the amendment lost. Clerk will please report the second amendment.
Delegate Pushkin moves to amend the bill on page 2, section 1, line 22, following the period by inserting a new subsection to read as follows.
Would the gentleman wish to explain this amendment in lieu of having it read? Yes, the gentleman is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe this is now an even more important amendment. Now that we've established what the bill is about, that this bill is simply to provide legal cover for those who would wish to discriminate against other people, I think that this next amendment is very necessary and would probably prevent a lot of bad situations from happening, probably avert a lot of bad situations from happening. What this would do is that those who would use this bill if it becomes law, as a legal cover to discriminate and refuse public accommodations, refuse service to people who they didn't want to serve, people whose lives they disapproved of, they would have to prominently place in their front window of their business exactly who they were going to refuse to serve. They should put right in the front window of the business who they're going to refuse to serve, and that way people would know whether they wanted to patronize these shops or not. I think it's important that we let the public know exactly who the bigots are.
Okay, the question is now on the amendment just explained by the sponsor, the gentleman from the 54th. Is there debate on the amendment? Gentleman from the 44th, Doug Kirby, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand to urge rejection of this amendment. And as I read over it on Saturday, I thought, this seems awfully familiar. I've seen this before somewhere. And it hit me that the last time that I'd read this is when I was in a college course at Marshall, and we were going over the Nuremberg laws, which dictated that any Jewish citizen of Germany had to have a white star on their business so that the brown shirts would know which businesses to come and attack and which families and which store owners they could assault and harass under the code of law. It's disheartening that this trick, which would lead to violence, which would lead to attacks, has been offered as an amendment to a bill that is simply a shield against the government from compelling us to do something that is against our religious liberties enshrined in the First Amendment, unless it is necessary to effectuate a compelling interest of this government. I would ask this body to reject this amendment, not only because it's the wrong thing to do, it would send a horrible message. And I'm not just talking it could possibly result in violence, it could possibly result in businesses being burned down. When the Dobbs decision came out just this past year, Antifa and their ilk unleashed violence and their mob rule across the streets of this nation, against the churches of this nation, against any fundamental Baptist, Catholic church that had the audacity to stand up and protect the rights of the unborn. And so if this amendment, which I feel strongly it will fail, but if it were to go into effect, you can rest assured that the violence and the intimidation that's perpetrated by Antifa against the conservatives and the traditional families and business owners of this country would be escalated, and now all these businesses in our state would have a convenient target on the front of their store. So please reject this amendment.
Gentleman from the 51st, Doug Fast, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wholeheartedly urge rejection of this amendment for all the reasons just stated by my friend from the 44th. Thank you.
Gentleman from the 79th, Doug Hansen's recognized.
I support the amendment. If a shopkeeper is going to be bigoted and refuse service to somebody because they're Jewish or Muslim or because they're gay, at least they should be man enough to publicize that so people know. People will be spared the awkwardness, the discomfort of going into a business and being told that they're not going to be served. At least be man enough to publicly acknowledge it, post something. Spare us.
The question is still on the amendment. Is there further debate on the amendment? Gentleman from the 47th, Doug Longacre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the gentleman from Mon County yield for a question?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. I just want to make sure it's registering with me what I'm hearing right now. And I just want to be sure, if the government in the future or a future executive, a governor, for example, were to tell my church that we must close, we're not allowed to meet and worship and give praise to our Father and declare our faith in that church because of some situation ongoing, and this bill, should it pass, would protect me and my church from that governor's executive order, does that make me a bigot?
This amendment has nothing to do with whether your church is going to stay open.
Yes or no, am I a bigot if this bill protects my church and permits us to worship?
This amendment has nothing to do with that. This amendment
Okay,
has
thank
to
you.
do with whether private citizens who own a business and decide that they're going to discriminate based on someone's faith or someone's sexual orientation have to notify people that they're going to discriminate. That's all this amendment does.
The question is still on the amendment. Is there debate on the amendment? Okay, if there's not, shall recognize the sponsor to close debate on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just repeat that this amendment has absolutely nothing to do with one's right to worship however and wherever they please. And I would remind the body, too, in case it comes up later, that even during the lockdowns of COVID, there were always exceptions for places of worship. Hasn't happened. We have a very strong First Amendment. All this amendment does to this bill, it says if a business is going to refuse service or public accommodation to somebody based on this bill, use legal cover to discriminate, they would have to post it. They would have to let people know. I think it would prevent a lot of uncomfortable situations, and it would allow people to know exactly who they were dealing with in business. And to be honest, I take umbrage with the comments comparing this to what happened in the late 30s in Germany when they were identifying Jews under the Third Reich. It's absolutely nothing to do with that. This is simply saying that those who would use this bill to promote hate, those who would use this bill to refuse service, should let people know ahead of time. I'd urge adoption of the amendment.
If the question is on the adoption of the amendment, those in favor of adoption of the amendment will please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. No. Okay, the noes have it. Chair declares that amendment lost. Clerk will please report the next amendment. Are there other amendments? If not, the clerk will please read the bill a third time.
Committee, substitute for House Bill 3042 relating to forbidding excessive government limitations on exercise of religion.
Are there objections to having the bill explained in lieu of having it read? Gentleman to 51st, Douglas Fast, to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill amends a section of code to codify the federal constitutional law test in cases where a person believes his or her or its free exercise of burden by state action has been impaired. The test currently, under current law, is by West Virginia court action, requires that when courts review these types of cases, they must employ a strict scrutiny test, the highest standard in the law. The state action which is determined to substantially burden a person's exercise of religion must determine if there is a compelling state interest in the action, the statute, law, or ordinance. If the court determines that there is a compelling state interest, then the court must decide whether the action is the least restrictive means of furthering the compelling state interest. This bill requires a court to weigh evidence and make determinations. Number one, is the act or omission a true exercise of religion? Number two, is the burden upon the true exercise of religion essential to further a compelling governmental interest? Number three, is this the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling governmental interest? Is the government treating religious conduct more restrictively than any conduct of reasonable, comparable nature? Is the government treating religious conduct more restrictively than any comparable conduct because of economic need or benefit? That's what this bill does. It is prescribing a judicial test when these types of cases come before the court. The relief available in the bill is injunctive or declarative with cost and reasonable attorney's fees should the person challenge the action prevail. If the court determines there is no substantial burden on the exercise of religion, the petitioner does not prevail. If the court determines there is no compelling interest, the petitioner prevails. If the court determines there is a compelling state interest and the action is the least restrictive means of furthering the interest, the petitioner does not prevail. If the court determines that the action is not the least restrictive means, the petitioner prevails. This law is not and does not determine who is a winner or loser. It does not create a license to discriminate. And for those reasons, Mr. Speaker, I urge passage.
The question before the House is, shall the bill pass? Gentleman from the 76th, Delegate Garcia, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman from the 51st yield for a few questions?
Yes.
Thank you. And you did a good job talking about the test and what it does. I had some questions about that, but I think you answered them very well. Does this apply, so the use of the term person is in here. How broad is that?
The term person is defined in another section of code. It normally means individual, entities alike.
Is that section of code linked to this article? Because I think
It's under the code section that provides construction of all code sections unless they are specifically stated otherwise in a particular code section.
Does that definition apply to a business?
It would.
Okay. The situations in which this law can be used, I heard it described as a shield, but can this law be used to strike down laws that are state laws prior to someone defending, for example, against some action taken by the government?
I'm not exactly sure I understand your question, but let me answer it this way. We could sit here all day and come up with multiple hundreds and thousands of scenarios as to where this law would apply or could apply. The bottom line is, as I stated, this law provides a judicial test when these types of cases to come before the court on the process that the court is to apply in deciding the case. That's what all this law does. It provides a judicial test.
For every law that's on the state books?
It provides a judicial test for any case that would come within the purview of this law, how any case that would come up, how the court is to handle that case, regardless of any scenario or situation we could describe.
Okay, and I'm trying to get at the practical use of when these cases would come up. And so when I'm looking at page 1 of the committee substitute under subsection B, and it talks about a person whose exercise of religion has been substantially burdened or is likely to be substantially burdened in violation of this article may assert such violation or impending violation. So my question is, does someone have to wait until an action is taken against them by the government based on a statute, or can they, prior to that, preemptively file a lawsuit to strike down a provision of code?
You read the language correctly. A person whose religion has been substantially burdened or is likely to be substantially burdened could bring a cause of action. That's expressly stated in the language you read.
Okay, so what I said was accurate. Okay. So are you aware of the reason behind federal RFRA that was passed back in the 1990s, the case that brought it about?
The peyote case?
Yeah,
Yeah.
there was a case related to
Yes.
individuals who ingested peyote based on their religious beliefs.
I remember the case, yes.
Okay. So similarly, we have a number of criminal laws related to drug use, drug possession. Would this bill potentially, like the federal law, allow for an individual to strike down or defend against the use of a criminal drug law in the state of West Virginia?
As I said, we could define and describe multiple different scenarios that may or may not come within the purview of this statute. But if it does come within the purview of this statute merely provides the process that the court is to apply in deciding that case.
So it sounds like we're providing for a process, and I think part of the debate that we're having here today is how far does this extend? Does it apply to some of these things or does it not apply? And that's what I'm trying to get at. I understand there's a process the court's going to go through, but depending on the language we put in here is whether a court can strike down a statute or not strike down a statute. I mean, wouldn't you agree these are fair questions?
It does provide injunctive relief, as you can read in the language of the statute, the proposed statute on page 1, subsection B.
Okay. So I want to ask about 3 different scenarios. And again, I think it's fair to ask these questions. The first one is with respect to immunizations, which this body we have some of the strictest immunization laws in the United States. So could this statute be used potentially to strike down an immunization law for children attending school?
I cannot tell you if it would be used to strike down an immunization law. What I can tell you is that if a case came before the court and one alleged that their sincerely held religious beliefs were encumbered by a law or an ordinance, that the court would have to make a determination: is the act or omission a true exercise of religion? Is the burden upon the true exercise of religion essential to further a compelling governmental interest? Is this the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling governmental interest? Is the government treating religious conduct more restrictively than any conduct of reasonable comparable nature? Is the government treating religious conduct more restrictively than any comparable conduct because of economic need or benefit? As I stated, we could go through your other 2 scenarios or this scenario, and my answer is going to be the same. It is a judicial test.
Okay, I've got one more scenario. I'll take the other one off the table, but this scenario is actually spelled out in the statute. What about abortion? What about somebody who we heard back in the fall about certain religious groups that believe in the right to abortion, including the Jewish faith, including some different Christian faiths? So what does the statute say about that?
The statute, I'm not going to read it verbatim, but it's very clear. It's on the last page of the bill, subsection 2.
Okay.
And
Am I
therein
correct
lies your
that
answer.
it excludes anybody for religious reasons who believes that the abortion laws of the state of West Virginia substantially burden their exercise of religion? Would that be a fair statement?
The gentleman can read the language and draw his conclusions accordingly.
So what happens if there is a test as far as how this applies equally under the United States Constitution? It's possible that if some religious beliefs are treated in a certain way and other religious beliefs are treated in another way, that this bill or some of the provisions could actually be struck down under the federal Constitution, correct?
This bill is extremely similar to the federal law. And so obviously if you have a federal question or a federal law that is being challenged or is being considered, then federal law would apply. Okay. And as you know, the courts have determined that the federal religious freedom law does not apply to state actions. And so hence that's why we're here discussing a state bill.
Thank you very much for your patience in answering those questions. Mr. Speaker, may I speak to the bill?
Gentleman is recognized.
So again, we're looking at this bill as a shield, but also a sword. And there are a number of different questions that the gentleman from the 51st can't answer or doesn't want to answer about the length this bill will go in striking down other laws or other rights that people might have. And I think it's important, again, when you look at the federal law and the reason it was passed back in the 1990s, it had to do with religious drug use. So what about those Rastafarians, or maybe the newly Rastafarian people in the state of West Virginia? Are they able to get around our drug laws? We've already heard an amendment that relates to the Human Rights Act, and we had an amendment that would have excluded that because, again, I've heard from a number of different people, oh, well, this bill really doesn't do anything to those ordinances. That's not who it's aimed at. But that amendment failed. It would not have hurt the bill if that was really true. But the funny thing is with abortion laws, because you could make a very good argument, and we have heard, again, testimony from people this last year, that there are religions where abortion is considered a right. So let me tell you what might happen. If there is a federal use of equal protection, someone can do a lawsuit that tries to take this law and strikes down maybe not the whole law, but that last exception with respect to abortion. And I think some of the people in this room might not be so happy if the rest of the law was left intact, and then we start to get lawsuits saying that all the bills that we passed this last year, in fact, infringe on people's religious freedoms and are therefore unconstitutional. That would not take any further act of the legislature. That is something that courts can do, not striking down the whole law, but striking down the part of it that's unconstitutional. So you may very well be doing something with this law that you're not intending to do. So it's a sword, it's a shield, and I think the worst thing about it, though, is the message that we're sending to businesses. We already had the debate on Form Energy, which I think very well could have made CEOs say, I don't know if I want to deal with this. And instead of doing more to try to help encourage businesses to come here, to provide a welcoming atmosphere, I think we're doing the same thing again with RFRA. It's another unforced error. So therefore, I'm against the bill. Thank you.
Gentleman from the 29th, Dillon's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The following words are enshrined in our state constitution. Since through divine providence we enjoy the blessings of civil, political, and religious liberty, we, the people of West Virginia, in and through the provisions of this Constitution, reaffirm our faith in and constant reliance upon God and seek diligently to promote, preserve, and perpetuate good government in the state of West Virginia for the common welfare, freedom, and security of ourselves and our posterity. I'm so thankful today that our religious liberty doesn't come from something we do in this room. It comes through divine providence from God Himself. And I'm so thankful that we have the opportunity today to simply codify this existing fact that individuals have a right to act upon their convictions at all levels throughout their lives. Thank you. I will be a strong yes, yay vote today.
Gentleman from the 54th, Doug Pushkin's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Vice Chair of Judiciary yield, please?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So, obviously, this bill is meant to strengthen the protection for religious freedoms in the state of West Virginia. Do you agree with that statement?
I'm sorry, could you?
Would you agree with the statement that this bill is aimed at strengthening religious freedoms for the citizens of the state of West Virginia?
Well, I will agree that the title is Equal Protection for Religious Act.
Equal protection
Equal Protection for Religion Act, yes.
for all religions.
Yes.
Okay. Can you name any instances where one's religious freedom has been infringed upon here in West Virginia?
You know, I'm not going to get into that. We could discuss and define scenarios all day long.
I'm not talking about
All I'm
futures.
saying is, this is a judicial test that when these types of laws come before the court, it provides the process upon which the court will follow to resolve the case.
Thank you. I read the bill. I'm not asking you about future scenarios. I'm talking about past history, things that actually happened or didn't happen, and you can't name one instance.
I didn't say I couldn't, I said I wouldn't.
Thank you. Okay. But do you believe that this bill would protect the rights of religious minorities in this state? That's something that's important to me. Would this bill protect the rights of those who don't worship like the majority?
It does not play favoritism to a majority religion or a minority religion. It's equal protection.
So it doesn't play favoritism. A couple more questions. When was this bill read a first time?
I believe it was Friday.
The evening session, Friday evening, it was read a first time?
I don't know if it was Friday evening
It
or
was
Friday
Friday
morning,
evening.
but it was.
When was it read a second time?
Let me clarify that. It was read pursuant to the House rules and then according to the procedure set forth in the House rules.
On Friday evening. So when was it read a second time?
Saturday, as I believe.
Well, why didn't we read it a third time yesterday?
I don't know, and I appreciate the House rules, and at this time, I no longer yield for questions.
Well, I thank you for the questions you did yield for, Mr. Speaker. We didn't read it yesterday because we observed what many people, most of the members of this body, and most people in the state of West Virginia observe as the Sabbath, to allow the majority to keep with the, I believe, the fourth commandment in the Ten Commandments. However, we did read it the first time on a Friday evening, and we read it the second time on a Saturday morning, which caused a couple of us to break the fourth commandment of the Ten Commandments and not observe the Sabbath, which just goes to prove a point. Not everybody believes and worships and prays exactly the same way, but we're all West Virginians, and we should be respectful of other people's faiths. I was brought up, taught to respect everybody's faith. That's why I stand in here respectfully every day when we say Christian prayers, even though I'm Jewish. I'm being respectful. So I take great interest in a bill that purports itself to protect the rights of religious minorities, since I've lived in West Virginia all my life, and all my life I've been a member of a religious minority. In fact, it's the reason why I'm here. You know, my family fled Eastern Europe over 100 years ago, where they were facing real persecution, being dragged out of their homes and often killed by Cossacks in Eastern Europe, and they came here so they could pray, worship, and live free from that tyranny. And you know what? They found it here, and they found it here in West Virginia. And I can't tell you what religious persecution is, because I've never experienced it. I can't even tell you what religious discrimination is, because I've never experienced it. No one in this country has ever had their religious freedom infringed upon. You can't give one example of it, because we have a First Amendment to the Constitution. We have an even stronger First Amendment in the West Virginia Constitution that protects our religious freedoms. We also have a Human Rights Act that sees religion as a protected class, and I can't be fired, I can't be kicked out of my house, I can't be refused public accommodations because of my religion. It's unfortunate we can't extend that to some other West Virginians who should be in the Human Rights Act, but we haven't done that. And I think that's what this bill is really about. That's what this bill is really about. Because I can tell you that no members of any religious minorities came to the public hearing and asked for stronger protections under the law, because we don't need it. Don't want it, don't need it. Haven't had any use for it. I've not received any calls from any of the rabbis in this state, imams, Buddhists, Hindus, anybody asking for this, from religious minorities asking for greater protection. You know why? Because we are all free to pray and worship however we want without infringement from the government because we have a First Amendment. It's worked. Nobody has asked for this. Which leads me to believe, what are we trying to do here? And the only logical explanation I can find is we're trying to provide legal cover for those who would discriminate against people who they disapprove of. People who would refuse public accommodations, who would refuse to serve, refuse to cater weddings or bake cakes for bar mitzvahs or whatever it might be, to refuse to serve people based on their religious beliefs. That's what this bill is aimed at doing. I think what we really have to ask ourselves here is, how would we want to be treated? When you're getting ready to vote for a bill that would provide legal cover for those who would discriminate, ask yourself if you'd want to be discriminated against. Even though I broke a commandment on Friday night when we read it the first time, and I broke a commandment on Saturday morning when we read it the second time, I'm not going to break the golden rule and vote for it on the third time, because I want to treat people the way I would want to be treated. And I'm not going to break the greatest commandment, which is simply to love each other, when we read this a third time and vote for this bill. There's only one reason for this bill: to provide legal cover for those who would refuse service and legally discriminate, allow people to legally discriminate against people who they don't approve of. We're better than that. I've gotten to know many of you over the past few weeks. Many of you I've worked with for years. I think you're better than this. I really do. So think about it before you vote. Really take a long, take your time and think about it before you vote. Do you want to put into code a legal cover so people can discriminate against people because they disapprove? I mean, let's cut to the chase. We know who we're talking about here, because the Human Rights Act covers religion, it covers race, it covers political parties, it covers, what doesn't it cover? It doesn't cover sexual identity, sexual orientation or gender identity. That's what it doesn't cover. So this is about whether or not you think somebody should be able to be kicked out of their apartment because they're gay. Somebody should be fired from their job because they're gay. Somebody can be refused service in somebody's store simply because they're gay. If you believe that, go ahead and vote for it. I don't think you do. I think you're better than that. Vote against this. Vote against this garbage.
Gentleman from the 100th, Doug Ridenhour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My wife is a Thai Theravada Buddhist. Her values comport exactly with this bill. She's fully in support of this bill. She believes, like I do, that religious freedom is a right that should be guaranteed, that we should be trying to protect at all costs. And I'm not supporting this bill because of her beliefs. She has her values, and she's going to support this type of bill. For my values and my beliefs, I'm going to be supporting this bill, and I urge passage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from the 2nd, Douglas Teselo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pretty impassioned debate. I come from a town where we have plenty of different religions. Most are Christian, but we have plenty. We've had all types of people, 54 different nationalities, and we've had very few problems, as the gentleman from the 54th said. If that was the case and we were talking about religious freedom the way it has been practiced forever in this country, that would be one thing. But I saw something today that disturbed me greatly. Apparently a teacher in Washington came up with a new term. Now, what was it? In speaking about the children that she teaches, she said, we must keep the children safe from their Christo-fascist parents. What does that even mean? What are we talking about here? And when I see things like that, I get a little taken aback and I get a little frightened. Because basically, that statement is just against everything that I've ever learned in this country and everything that I've ever practiced since I was a small child. We were always taught to respect everybody, and we need to do that. We cannot have people telling us that we can't tell our children how we think they should live. When those types of things start to happen in this country, we're in big trouble. And for that reason, to my colleagues, I will be voting yes on this bill, and we need to make sure that the First Amendment actually means something and will continue to mean something. Thank you.
Gentleman from the 27th, Douglas Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think about this in a little bit of a different way here, too. As I hear this debate, I don't think any of us are against discrimination or for discrimination, but inadvertently, we may put a crack in a door here. And I'm going to refer to one of the concerns that I have, and once again, as my colleague mentioned earlier, about vaccinations. I can see, I don't think Moses came down from Mount Sinai with an 11th commandment against vaccinations, and I think it's a complicated issue to say whether it's your religious belief or not. But as I look at this subject and I think about what could possibly occur, I'm reminded of some statistics. One is that in 1900, the life expectancy in America was 46. It's 30 years longer now, largely due to vaccinations and improvements in medicines. And I think about the thing that I often hear that I think applies here, and that is that parents know best what's good for their children. And I think, is that true? Well, we have 7,000 children in foster care, the highest percentage in the nation. We're the third in the nation per capita in child abuse. 25.2% of West Virginia smokers in our state. We're second in the nation for drug abuse and fourth in the nation for gambling addiction. Now, the reason I mention this is I think that if we open the crack of this door, that children are going to be put at risk because of the desire to create that religious exemption. And just today, I was reminded in the news that there's a measles case in Kentucky linked to a viral Christian revival at Asbury University. Now, I am a Christian. One of the problems I have with this bill is Christ's story about the Good Samaritan. It was the two religious people that crossed the road to avoid providing service for the man in this story. And I sometimes think that when we become so certain of the virtue of our opinions, we often don't realize how that discriminates against someone else. And as a person of faith, I don't want anybody to be discriminated upon, and at the same time, I don't want us with this bill to create a crack in the door to lead to legal things that could put our children and their health at risk. And I fear this is going to do this. And for that reason, I will be opposing this bill. And I often think about my ninth grade science. I've told many of you this story. My ninth grade science teacher told me the scientific method applies to everything in life. You observe, you gather data, you experiment, and then you draw a conclusion. But what we all tend to do, she said, is to start with a conclusion and only look for data to back up your preconceived notion. I think we all have been prey to that foible. And I ask that you consider this. There are other ways we can accomplish this. We already have protections with the First Amendment and laws that protect against discrimination. But I worry that the crack in the door is going to cause a lawsuit over this and a declaration that my religion says I don't have to do this. And therefore, among those parents that I listed in the negative sense in our society will then choose to not protect their children, and their children will be at risk. I went to school with a young man who had polio. They let him out of the school, every classroom, 3 minutes early, so with his crutches and his braces, he could make his way to the next class. I can't imagine that happening again. And I worry that this bill could potentially cause that to happen to many of our young people. So I love you all. I love your passion for what you believe in. I share that passion for a love for West Virginia and our citizens, but I ask that you consider that this may have an adverse effect that would cause to put children at risk. So please, think about that before your vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from the 44th, Delegate Kirby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a co-sponsor of this bill, I feel obligated to this body and to the people at home and the people across this state to explain what this bill actually does, and the Vice Chairman from Judiciary did an excellent job. But with respect to the specific questions that were brought up by the gentleman from the 76th, the answer, in my opinion, and based on Supreme Court case law, is the same. In each one of these examples that you provided, the test goes like this. The court looks at the case, they look at the facts before them, and they ask, is the person's religious belief being burdened by government action? Step one. If the answer to this question is yes, they move on to step two. Is that burden essential to further a compelling government interest? If the answer to that question is yes, they move on to step three. In that case, it has to be narrowly tailored to achieve the compelling interest. So if you apply the facts and the hypothetical set forth by the gentleman from the 76th, the question comes down to, do immunization laws violate people's religious beliefs? Well, yes. The answer to that is there are plenty of people who do not believe that it is within their religious code or their religious ethics for them to go and have vaccines applied to them, especially to their children. And it may not be generally to every vaccine. There may be certain vaccines that use certain medical technology and certain underlying medical procedures that you disagree with wholeheartedly and that your religion does not allow you to take part in. So then the next question would be, does the government have a compelling interest to vaccinate our children, to have a vaccinated public? And we all got our opinions, but that's why the people at the Supreme Court of Appeals here in this state and the U.S. Supreme Court of Appeals in Washington, that's why they get the big bucks, so that they can apply the facts of each and every one of these cases and determine whether or not the government is justified in compelling a person to violate their religious beliefs. We're not talking about some minor issue or some minor impediment upon an American or a West Virginian. We are talking about violations of the First Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. So I won't belabor the point by going through each one of the scenarios like marijuana, abortion, and so forth. I mean, I guess there's a chance the government could say there's a compelling interest for the state to want there to be abortion. I guess you could say that they think there's a compelling interest for marijuana and other drugs to be accepted out through this clause, but I doubt that that'll ever happen, although that's been used by the opponents of this bill as a scare tactic. Earlier, a gentleman from the 54th said there are no religious freedoms being infringed upon. I mean, that's amazing to hear someone in this body, anyone honestly, say that there are no examples across this state or across this country of religious freedoms being infringed upon. I'll just give you a few. Teachers throughout this nation and throughout this state and some municipalities are being forced to push the left's agenda, the government's agenda, within the war on traditional families with such things as promoting transgenderism, homosexuality in our classrooms, in our grade school classrooms. And these policies are sold to the American public and to the labor unions, the teachers' unions, as being open, which that may be the intention, but what is happening is these teachers' and administrators' rights are being violated. Their religious beliefs are being infringed upon because they're being forced and compelled to speak in a way that violates their religious beliefs. So there's one. How about just a couple years ago? Nurses being forced to be vaccinated. People that we look to take care of our medical needs when we're in our worst conditions. The people that are very well educated on the effects of vaccines, both the side effects and the benefits from the vaccines. We told them, you do not have a choice. You have to get vaccinated, even if it violates your most fervently held religious beliefs. Doctors are forced to perform abortions, not necessarily in this state anymore, thanks to this body's work in the last special session. Pharmacists are forced to provide abortion prescription pills against their faith and against their religion. Churches in some municipalities are forced to hire employees that go directly against the religious beliefs. So to say that there are no religious infringements or no infringements upon religious liberty in this state, I wish it were true. I wish that were the case, and this bill may not be necessary. In closing, I'll say this. We are not opening a door or creating any new rights. This bill simply codifies the existing U.S. Supreme Court case law and the U.S. Supreme Court of Appeals here in this state's rulings that this test must be administered to these types of cases. And so what we're seeing now and what the people at home are seeing is a very clear division between the two schools of thought in this body. One side thinks that the government knows best no matter the infringement. There's always a compelling interest because government knows best. Parents are not capable of raising their children and making the right decisions. So the government has to be the nanny, and the government has to tell them what to do, even if it violates their religious beliefs, because there's always a compelling interest. The other side of us, hopefully almost all of us, in the Republican Party, especially the conservatives within this party, believe that the government is not the answer. And in a lot of instances, the government is the problem. And the government has no right to infringe upon our religious beliefs unless there is a narrowly tailored law that is necessary to complete a compelling interest. And that's the division you're seeing here today. With that in mind, I urge passage of this bill. Thank you.
Lady from the 81st, I got Walker is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, colleagues. I was going to start this out by asking the chair of Judiciary to yield, but I'm not going to go that route because I heard what the vice chair had to say over and over. It's a judicial test. Read the bill. How ironic. Reading is fundamental. But I'm going to ask these questions anyway. And I've sat and I've taken notes, and I sat and I took notes during the public hearing, and we're going to speak about that public hearing at the end of my remarks. But during that public hearing, many of our constituents, some of your friends and pastors and neighbors, and some of us that you turn your nose at and judge, they kept referring to RFRA. They kept referring to what president signed it. But nobody referred to what was the point of RFRA. To protect religious minorities. So now I'm going to start with my questions. And they're not going to be answered because none of the questions were really answered in this body today. And each of you know that I respect each and every one of you, especially those of you that I've gotten to know in committee meetings. But some of my constituents, but mostly your constituents, sent me these messages. And you like to FOIA me a lot, so I suggest that you do it. But that's in the name of freedom, and I stand on it. Because if I can say it to one, I can say it to all. because what you do in the dark will come to light. So how many religious minority groups do we have in West Virginia? I don't know. Do you take the city council person from Fairmont who called me demonic as someone promoting their religion? I don't know. Do you take the person from Berkeley County who sent me a interesting email on the first day of Black History Month last year with a KKK meeting? Was that in the name of religion? Because I took a stance by introducing a bill with my shield from the 79th District. I don't know. Is it the city attorney in Westover who decided to call me a derogatory word in an executive session and someone recorded it? Was that in the name of religion, freedom? Was that person upset because I have the right to the U.S. Constitution to gather and protest and march? But I guess that was in religion, freedom. But religion minorities isn't defined in this bill. And no specific religion is defined in this bill. So will this bill allow sex discrimination? Could it also violate the civil rights of others? As my friend from the 44th said, maybe hiring someone in their business could be against someone's religious freedom. I don't know, maybe because that person may be part of the queer community and you don't want to serve them, and that's part of your religious freedom. Interesting. Could this allow a placement agency to place one of our precious children in foster care with the family? And remember, this child is being removed from harm and abuse and neglect. But the family that they're placing the child with, it may be against their religious freedoms for this child to have certain medical treatments such as blood transfusions. Yeah, you got to think about that. Or what if this child likes using the pronouns of they and them? It could be against religious freedoms. What if this particular child who is in the foster care system is also a parent and needs to be on contraceptives? We have to talk about those uncomfortable things because they exist in West Virginia. And last year we had one of those foster care children to come and speak to health. And she was a parent within the system. So she's with the foster care parent, and it's against their religious freedom for her to continue to have contraceptives. Then I guess she's not going to go see her OB. Could a company refuse insurance coverage for birth control in the name of religious freedom? A place of business refuse to do something as simple as making a cake, a flower arrangement even for a funeral. Refuse to sell a car because maybe a couple is unmarried. Maybe they are of the same sex. A single parent, a religious minority, but what about an interracial couple? In the name of religion freedom. We speak about all kind of oaths in this house. We took an oath. Our first responders take an oath. Nurses take an oath. Physicians take an oath. But that can go all out the window because of religious freedom. What if that nurse is taking care of someone who has been assaulted by a partner? Could even be their child. Could have even been a stranger if it was sexual assault. And it is against that nurse, the physician. Let's take it even further. Even about the person who is registering them in the system. It is against their religion to even register that person so they can receive services in wild and wonderful West Virginia. Now, the delegate from the 51st said we can go through all kinds of scenarios. And we should. Absolutely. Because this is major. We speak about the Fairness Act. I've been trying year and year just to get the Crown Act on the agenda. But I'm told, oh no, we can't open up the Human Rights Code, Danny. That's covered. So in order for me to have the freedom to wear my hair as I choose, I have to change my religion to Rastafarian? In the USA of what? In West by God, Virginia? What? I have to change my religion so I can be protected by my employment, where I choose to live, or getting any public services. Now, by no means do I think that the gentleman from the 44th, being a co-sponsor, wants to discriminate against anyone. And I stand by that. But I also, as I was taking notes, my good friend spoke about the labor union, transgender individuals, homosexuals. If you didn't know, now you know I'm queer. My partner is a female, not your business, but since government wants to be the nanny, I guess you want to be my daddy and my mother and take a resume on my genitals, so there you go. Oh, it's quiet again in here. I can't even hear a mouse pissing on cotton. It's been interesting, this legislative session. I feel good when I travel to your districts. And my friend from the 12th says, Danny, I didn't know that you were coming to my hometown. You should have called me. But little did you know that I got to send people before me to see how many of your businesses have the sticker of all kinds welcome. You can shake your head in denial, but that's what I do. And by all means, this is not a call out. This is a call in. Today I was in the governor's reception room along with my good friends, the senators from Mon County. And somebody raised their hand and they said, how are we going to keep young people in the state? I said, at what age? You mean the 8-year-olds who's trying to get health care? The 20-year-olds who wants to have control over their own bodies? The person who just wants prevailing wage, safety in the workplace? But we can do all this in the name of religion, freedom. We even talked about burning down businesses. When I first moved here in 2010, I thought you lost your mind by burning down couches. when somebody won a game. You burn down couches when my neighbors were houseless underneath the bridge. You burn down couches when there was families who had to sleep on the floor. Now, what freedom is that? We talk about protecting the unborn. I get it. But what about the born? At what point do you stop protecting them? Because the foster care system is busting at the seams. The drug epidemic is leaving from Wood, and it's going to Mon, and it's coming to Kanawha and Cabell and Mingo and McDowell and Mercer and Berkeley. We got to think about all those things. And it's a heavy conversation. And I'm not even done yet. So as my good friend who's always visiting us here on the Democratic side, who gives wise words from Delegates shot, who are you mad at? We was all mad during the pandemic. Shut down places of worship. And I even heard that secular places were open. So do we think that someone was really upset with religion? Or can we look at the science of when those places were open? See, it's mighty funny that we don't like to look at science, but we like to look at judicial things. We like law and order, but we don't want science to be part of that. But without forensic, you wouldn't even have the evidence. So what evidence do you ignore, and at what point? Even in judicial tests can be scientific. I may not be the sharpest tack on the wall, but I promise you I can hang with the toughest. We're not opening a door. Absolutely right. Because you're shutting it in the faces of many. I want to bring you back. And I already know that I'm going to have some colleagues come up to my desk after. I want to have a hard conversation. The gentleman for the 47th and I celebrated all week last week that we voted together. But remember, in the name of religion is why we had the Jim Crow South and segregation. Or was that the government being a nanny? Or the government being an overseer? These are the things that we have to think about, y'all. Whites only, colored only. Was that in the name of religion? I want to read something that someone sent to me. Here's my statement. I also want to add a trigger warning for you because it's kind of heavy. And I want to make sure that you're in the right headspace. I call that respect. I grew up in Hurricane, West Virginia, and currently live in Morgantown, West Virginia. I was a devout Christian growing up. I have read the Bible multiple times, all the way through, and spent years studying it, even bringing it to school throughout middle school and high school so that I could read it during every free moment I had. A lot has changed since then. It is clear to me now, through my experiences, that these churches already have more than just religious freedoms. They have the ability to get away with anything without repercussions. When I was a teenager, my youth pastor did just that. This was someone who I admired and trusted for years, and someone who I now understand had groomed me since I was 11. Someone who I was supposed to feel safe with, who was supposed to be ordained by God. When it came to light that he was sexually abusing me, he hid behind repentance. He was fired quietly and was allowed to put out a statement to the church saying that he was resigning for personal reasons and asked that his privacy be respected. Afterwards, he was able to immediately get a job at the bank right beside the church and now owns businesses blocks away from the very building where RFRA is being debated today. Meanwhile, I was left with a lifetime of trauma and justice, and no justice. My story is not unique. There were many before me and many after me who have experienced the same thing in these Christian environments. Because let's be real, those are the only people who support RFRA and who would stand to gain anything from this legislation. And no other organization that works with children. Would that man have been able to face no consequences and still be walking free today as a pedophile? Christians are not persecuted in America. RFRA is a blatant excuse to discriminate and elevate one religion above any other. If what happened to me and so many others can happen before RFRA, I'm horrified to think what these churches will be able to get away with afterwards. That's from a West Virginian who is still staying with us and amongst us. We had a public hearing on Friday. We had 50 speakers plus one. Now, I understand our penmanship in West Virginia is not the greatest. And I love the job that our sergeant at arms does. Because if you're not speaking, you cannot sit on this floor. Now, amongst you, we are all unique in our own ways. And when I say only, it's not to shine a spotlight on me, because I don't want it. I want the same freedoms, but I want something more than equality. I want equity. And that's something that we can't get right in this chamber. But I'm going to keep having those conversations with you guys, and we're going to keep standing on it, and we're going to move forward on it one day. But there was a lady that was sitting on the other side of the chamber. And I tried to get the attention from the gentleman from the 51st and saying, we have one more speaker. I looked through the paperwork. I asked for Keisha McDonald to come and meet me. And we found her name. Now, what was so unique about Keisha, she and I were the only two black women sitting on the floor. Now, I know my friend did not discriminate at all. On the side, they had a no-show. And sometimes we can't give that grace if anybody else, as a chairman of Judiciary has anything to say that they can come up to the microphone. I get that. But as your colleague, if I'm telling you that I see someone who is here, that I have witnessed sign that has not spoken, how about you use that religious freedom and give me some grace and mercy? Now, I appreciate the gentleman speaking to Keisha and telling her, I'm right here, tell me what you need to say. In a public hearing, we do one-on-ones. Where's the freedom? Now, what that gentleman did was turn the microphone back on. And that's where change occurs. And Keisha was able, as a West Virginian and one of the co-founders of West Virginia Black Pride, to use her voice. Where the equity would have been is that as Keisha sat down and listened to all other 50 speakers, was that the chambers would have been quiet. And everyone who spoke before her could have heard her words also before we ended the public hearing. So sometimes freedom ain't fair. Perfect example of equality and not equity. So, Equal Protections for Religion Act. What about equity for diversity? Equity for affordable housing? Equity for health care? Equity for the right to food? Equity for my hair? Equity for transportation? Equity for a livable wage? And equity for equity? I'm almost done.
Gentleman will state the point.
Please. While I appreciate the gentlelady's passion for all these social justice areas, I think we need to return to the bill and debate the bill that we're about to vote on, please.
Okay, in light of that point, ladies may continue.
Okay, so let's talk about religion freedom. When we talk about these issues, religion freedom of diversity. Maybe wearing a head wrap, is that diverse enough? Let's talk about religion freedom for affordable housing. We love when we call the Amish to come build something for us. But do we give those same freedoms for West Virginians if they want to pitch a tent in their front yard or their backyard? Let's talk about religion freedom to the right to food. Because as we have several religious minorities in here, and I'm specifically speaking about the gentleman from the 79th and the gentleman for the 54th, religion freedom. Most of my Muslim friends do eat pork. But if there is only a Dollar General there, I think that constitutes to the right to food in the name of religion freedom. Religion freedom. Hair. Let's talk about locks. How many tables did you stop by for West Virginia Black Policy Day? So you can understand that Rastafarian is a religion. And hair of locks, I guess, will not be protected. Religion freedom of transportation. We have diverse communities. We could put ATVs on the road now in West by God. And we give that freedom of horse and carriage. See, it's all intersectional. And that's the beauty of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I will be a strong no on House Bill 3042. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from the 94th, Doug Kump.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak on the bill. To the disappointment of some of my delegate friends, I'm not going to move the previous question, even though I know that probably just about everybody here has decided how they're going to vote on this particular bill. During the discussion and debate on this bill, comment was made about the lack of religious discrimination, and I feel compelled to speak on that issue. I take exception, even umbrage, to that statement. Give you a little background. My mother's maiden name is Steinbach, German Jews. My father was a member, my late father was a member of a mainstream Christian church. I'm now a man of faith, but I wasn't always so. At age 12, I questioned the meaning of life. And I wavered between agnosticism and atheism. And after many years, at age 21, I became a man of faith. But let me tell you about my faith. The people of my faith were run out of the state of New York because of their faith. They went to Ohio. They were run out of Ohio because of their faith. They went to Missouri. And in Missouri, the mob ransacked their homes, ravished their women, murdered some of their children, and they were run out again to the state of Illinois. Mob action again came against them, and they fled once more, outside of the boundaries of this nation at the time, to the territory of Mexico, to an area which now is known as Utah. I believe in this bill. I've read it, I've prayed about it, I've pondered about it. I believe we should vote for it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman, Ms. 79, Delegate Hansen's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This debate is getting somewhat personal for some of us. I don't start most of my remarks in this way, but I will mention, for those who don't know, that I'm one of the other Jews in this chamber, in this legislature. Gentlemen from the 54th and I are the only Jews that I'm aware of here, members of a religious minority, and for that reason, I think qualified to talk about our feelings about how this might impact religious minorities. And I would start by saying that nobody asked us, as members of religious minorities, whether we like this bill or didn't like this bill, how we could tweak the bill, maybe how it could be made better. I'm still not convinced that it really is about protecting religious minorities. The gentleman from the 51st, in response to questions, talked about all this bill does is provide a judicial test. But I think it's a whole lot more than that. And I think the examples provided by the gentleman from the 44th were instructive, because it is about cases like that. It's about specific cases related to religion and related to discrimination that judicial test will be used. That's what this bill is about. It's about Morgantown's non-discrimination ordinance that we're very proud of, because we have an inclusive community, an open community that makes people want to move to Morgantown to take jobs, that makes employers want to come to Morgantown to create jobs. Because people in same-sex relationships can't be fired from their job for that reason. People in same-sex relationships can't be kicked out of their apartment by their landlord for that reason. That's what our non-discrimination ordinance does, and the similar NDOs across the state of West Virginia. That's what they do. It's important. I wish we had that statewide, but we can't get that passed. That's what this bill is about. This bill is also about medical care. It's about whether, like the gentleman from the 44th said, whether a pharmacist can refuse to dispense medication. Let's say an unmarried woman comes in for birth control. Can a pharmacist refuse to fulfill that prescription? What if a gay man comes in for an HIV pill? Can they refuse to fulfill that prescription? I think that's what this is about. It's about whether a doctor can refuse medical care. If there's a rape victim, can they be denied emergency birth control? Or can a pregnant woman who's miscarrying be denied an abortion even though it's the safest medical alternative because it goes against that doctor's religious views? And sometimes these medical decisions are very time sensitive. So is somebody just going to excuse themselves and say, sorry, you're not getting that operation now. You'll have to find someone else. And the hospital has to scramble to find somebody who might be able to do it, save a person's life. These are the types of situations that this bill is all about. These are not just hypotheticals. This is the bill. I also mentioned in judiciary a situation, an unfortunate situation in Morgantown with our mosque, where before the service, a police officer comes and guards the mosque, guards the people who are coming in to worship. Can a police officer refuse those orders because it's against their deeply held religious beliefs? And I just wanted to say a little bit more about being Jewish and how this impacts our faith and how it makes us feel. And this was mentioned a long time ago, maybe an hour ago, in the original questions from the gentleman from the 76th. This bill before us today has one very explicit exception: abortion. It's written into the bill. Now, when we were debating abortion in the special session, we had testimony from a rabbi from Wheeling who testified that abortion is a deeply held religious belief from Jews, of Jews. He goes back to the Old Testament and the interpretation of that among Jews. Rabbi Urecki from Charleston had an op-ed in the newspaper with similar religious views. I know that the rabbi at my synagogue in Morgantown shares those beliefs. These are deeply held religious beliefs of, if not all Jews, many Jews. Jews in congregations in West Virginia. But the majority party and the majority religion took it upon themselves when they wrote this bill to specifically exempt one particular deeply held religious belief, that being a belief of Jews. And I think that's wrong, and I think that's offensive. To put this bill up as something that's protecting the rights of religious minorities, but writing something into it that specifically takes away one of those rights. And I'll close with this. I got an email from my congregation toward the end of last week. I don't remember exactly what day, probably Thursday or so. All it said was, services are canceled this weekend. Do not come to the synagogue. No explanation, no context. So I was wondering what was going on. I did a little research and I discovered that Saturday, 2 days ago, was the National Day of Hate, where a group of neo-Nazis and white supremacists across the country are threatening violence and intimidation at synagogues and against Jewish people across the country. And this was a national issue. Synagogues were closed all across the country. Guards, additional security were provided at synagogues across the country. But it impacted us right here in West Virginia. Just 2 days ago, the National Day of Hate. Thankfully, as far as I know, nothing happened. So I thank our law enforcement community and people of all faiths who rose up against that, against white supremacy, against the neo-Nazis that were asserting themselves. But if you were to ask us, if you were to ask me what I thought religious minorities in this state and this country need in terms of religious freedom, it's protection against the neo-Nazis, it's protection against the white supremacists, people who shut down our synagogues and our mosques. That's the type of religious freedom I think we need, not this bill.
Is there debate on the bill? Gentleman number 17, Tuckett Penson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, thank you for your time today. We've sat for a long time now and we've listened to the debate of several individuals who are concerned about this bill or are in support of this bill. I would submit to you that we in this body are lawmakers. We determine what's right and what's wrong, what's legal and what's illegal, and I believe that that's part of what makes this bill difficult. In this bill, we are not determining something to be legal, and we're not determining something to be illegal. Rather, we're creating a judicial test. We're giving statutory instructions to the judiciary that when a RFRA case, when a case where someone would allege that a law that we pass in this body or a local municipal ordinance or county ordinance is in violation of their religious conviction, that the judiciary is to use this two-question test. Number one, is there a compelling state interest? And number two, is the state acting in the least restrictive means possible? I've been asked by a friend of mine who's on the fence about this bill, why do you care about this so much? Why are you advocating for this bill? And the answer that I gave him without the opportunity to think on it, I believe having now the opportunity to consider that question and the answer that I gave, I believe it was the right one. The answer that I gave him was when one of our constituents comes to us and says the law that was passed or the ordinance that was passed is in violation of my religious conviction, what do we do with them? How do we help them? And the answer in the United States for 30 years has been this bill. The answer has been the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I've only stood on this House floor just a few times this year. I made it a goal to only stand on this House floor a few times, 3 to be exact. The first time I stood on this House floor was to defend a bill where we would add unborn children to those who are protected by the DUI causing death statute. And I asserted to this body that when we pass this, we could be protecting children. I made that claim in hopes that it was an accurate claim. The second time I stood on this House floor was to defend the foster care communication portal, and I said that this will help foster care in West Virginia, and I hope that's an accurate claim. But the reason I mentioned that to you today is I made claims on this floor that I hope are substantiated, but with this bill, we have 30 years of case law, 30 years of a track record. I have in my possession and are available to any of you hundreds of pages of law review articles how this law has been interpreted on a federal level and in 32 other states over the last 3 decades. We do not have to guess or speculate what the results of West Virginia passing the Religious Freedom Restoration Act will be. We don't have to do that. This is unique in that we are not launching out into uncharted waters. I respect every person who's spoken today, and I respect that they're speaking from their conscience, what they feel's right in their constituency, what they feel that their constituency would have them to do. But the truth of the matter is, the laws that fall under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act purview are well documented. And just as many laws are dismissed, just as many cases, rather, are dismissed as an inappropriate attempted use of this, as are actually heard. The vast majority of cases, they don't even have anything to do with mainstream Christianity. I have a law review article here that was written in 2018, and it studied every single federal RFRA case that existed from 1993 into 2018, an average of 2.88 cases per year. So let me just give you the history and I'll close. The federal government passed the federal RFRA in 1993, a unanimous United States of Representatives House unanimously passed this. It then went to the Senate, where it received 97 of 100 senators in the United States of America voted in favor of this. It was signed into law in 1993 on a federal level. It was later ruled that the federal RFRA did not apply to states, so states began passing their own state RFRA. As we stand here today, 23 states have passed this in their respective states. 9 others have it as a Supreme Court ruling. To be honest with you, I believe if a RFRA case were to arise today, I believe our state Supreme Court would apply this very standard. They have it in their purview to apply this very standard. I believe they would. But this judicial test would be written into state statute. Then in closing, I'll mention this. This bill passed on this House floor in 2012 under a Democrat majority. This bill passed on this floor 92-2. In 2016, this bill passed under a Republican majority. 4 years later, 72-26. This will be the third time that this House has considered whether every West Virginian, regardless of their belief system, deserves a fair hearing when government tries to impose a law that would otherwise violate their beliefs. This bill restricts the compulsion of action from the government on West Virginia citizens. I believe this is needful. We'll join several other states in protecting our citizens from the overreach of government. Mr. Speaker, I urge passage.
Is there other debate on the bill? Gentleman from 57, Douglas Scaff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, we've heard a lot today. We spent an hour and a half, and this will be the fastest speech I've ever given. You know, what I did here in committee was not one religious group came in support to testify that we needed this. But you know what else I heard? The business community testified against. They testified against. Overwhelmingly. 98% of Fortune 500 companies don't discriminate, but that's okay. And then just in reference, he sparked something. Yeah, I was here. I was here all those years you mentioned. 2016, guess who gave a speech against this? Guess who gave a speech against this? Guess who killed this? Senate President Mitch Carmichael. Guess who's leading the charge for economic development in West Virginia now? Guess who's bringing all those businesses here? Thank God he did kill this. Thank God he did. So I'll leave you with this. I was going to ask some questions, but I already know the answers to, so I'm not going to waste everyone's time. What are our priorities? Are we for local control or not? What does this do to the 15 communities across West Virginia that adopted a non-discrimination clause? Does it leave it to interpretation? The answer is yes. Are we for clarity or interpretation in every case law. Does this create jobs or does it not? What message are we sending to the people of West Virginia? What message are we sending to the people of America? And I thought West Virginia was open for business. I guess just not to all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there other debate on the bill? If not, Chair recognizes the gentleman in the 51st Docket Fast to close debate on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I would ask for the same latitude to discuss what happened in the public hearing that was held just the other day on this particular bill. It came down to one name that was written in cursive, and it was not legible. It was written over top of a part of the form where there was other printed words, but right above where this name was written, it said, "Please print your name." That didn't happen. I could not read the name, so therefore I asked the clerk if he could help me read the name, and we tried to decipher a name, and therefore I announced what we thought the name was 2 or 3 times, and no one came forward. That was the last name on that side of the bill, for or against. And so then we had the other speakers, and I concluded the hearing. At that point, the lady from the 81st made a commotion, got my attention. I asked what was going on. I was told that there was a person who did not get to speak. When I realized what happened, I then immediately instructed the staff to re-engage the microphone system. The room was still filled with a lot of people. I announced very loudly that there was another person yet to speak. Everyone quieted down, gave this lady our full attention, and then everyone else who got to speak was limited to 90 seconds. We gave this person over 2 minutes to speak. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that. Now, what I'm hearing, I think we could boil down to a couple of situations about this bill. That this is a license to discriminate against someone who practices a certain lifestyle, or a license to allow a religious objection to mandatory immunizations. So ask yourself a question. What if you do have a person who truly believes, according to their religion, according to their faith, that some lifestyle was wrong, or some state action is wrong, perhaps according to the Quran or according to the teachings of the Bible? What if? What if you have that? Well, this bill still does not decide who wins or loses in that case. What this does is say that if you are a person of faith and you do have sincerely held religious beliefs, that you do not have to back down, you do not have to accept a lifestyle or actions or activities without a fair playing field in the court system. It still doesn't mean you win, but it does say you will have a fair playing field in the court system. I urge passage, Mr. Speaker.
Question before the House is, shall the bill pass? Those in favor of passage of the bill will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. The clerk will prepare the machine. Has every member voted? If so, the clerk will close the machine and ascertain the result on this question. There are 86 ayes, 12 nays, 2 members absent. Majority of members in the affirmative. The chair declares the bill passed. The clerk will please report the title.
Committee substitute for House Bill 3042 relating to forbidding excessive government limitations on exercise of religion.
Are there title amendments? If not, the title as read by the clerk will be and remain the title of the bill. The clerk will please communicate the action of the House and the Senate. Next bill on third reading.
Committee substitute for House Bill 3095, creating special revenue account known as School Building Authority Agricultural, Vocational, and Technical Training Facilities Grant Fund.
96th.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that we postpone action 1 day.
Are there objections to postponing action one day? No objections are heard. Action will be postponed one day. Next bill on third reading.
Committee substitute for House Bill 3211 relating to authorized service credit for unused accrued annual or sick leave days for use in determining retirement benefits in the municipal police office